This is Vanessa Gorman. Today we're going to talk about Greek relative clauses, another kind of subordinate clause that usually takes the indicative. However, it functions differently from other subordinate clauses, and so I want to treat it as a separate category. It's different in that it is not introduced by a subordinating conjunction. There is no so that or in order that or something like that. Instead, what it has is some kind of relative word, a word that is a pronoun or an adjective or an adverb that modifies a word in the other clause, the clause upon which it is dependent, what they sometimes call the matrix clause. So it's very closely tied to the main clause because it is tied directly to some word in that main clause. These are clauses that are usually translated who or whose or whom or which or that. They can also be adverbial where or when. Now, the key terminology here is the word upon which it is reliant, the word that it modifies in the matrix clause is called the antecedent. And this is something that your English teachers, I hope, have been harping upon you throughout your writing career to make sure you have a clear antecedent. When you give a pronoun or when you give something like that, you need to have an antecedent that is very carefully defined. And in Greek, it's easier to do because of this relative clause is much more closely tied because of its inflection. Now, there are definite relative clauses. These are the ones that refer to a specific antecedent. So, for example, Alcibiades, whose father died when he was young, right? Alcibiades is a specific person. We're not just talking about anyone whose father dies when he's young. We're talking about a specific person. So, this is very definite. That vase that has a crack in it was damaged in transport. When you're talking about a thing, you usually use that or which. If it's indefinite, that means there's no specific antecedent, and it's anyone whose father died when he was young, any vase that is cracked, whatever vase that is cracked. So we're going to be treating these differently because there's different words for them in Greek, just as we have different words in English. The difference between who and whoever. So whoever comes in late will be penalized. It's not a specific person, it's anyone who fulfills that circumstance. Um, the other terminology that I'm going to talk to you about, and this is more important in English than in Greek, I think, but the idea of restrictive relative clauses, if it defines the antecedent, it's necessary to understand the sentence. The reason I say it's more important in English is because in English, you do not put a restrictive clause in commas. It's not enclosed in commas. And for neuters, you use that. So the vase that has a crack in it was damaged in transport. We're defining which vase. So we've got a dozen vases here. Only one of them has a crack in it. It was damaged in transport. So without that phrase, this sentence doesn't mean the same thing. The sailor who survived the battle gave an account of the loss. So it's defining which sailor. It's not just incidental information. Non-restrictive relative clauses are digressive. These are just adding extra information to liven up the sentence. Um, they can be omitted without changing the meaning of the sentence. These are the ones that in English you enclose in commas, and for neuters you translate which. So Alcibiades, whose father died when he was young, grew up in Pericles' house. That's not information we need to have. It's not necessary for the meaning of the sentence. It just adds additional information, as opposed to the sailor who survived the battle is telling me which sailor. The vase, which has a crack in it, was used to collect ballots. The fact that it has a crack is incidental in this sentence. So we use which and we put it in commas, whereas in the first example, the vase that has a crack in it is defining which vase we're talking about. So that's the difference between restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. Now, the relative pronoun or adjective will match its antecedent in gender and number. However, it takes its case from what it's doing in the subordinate clause. Okay, so this is an important principle to remember. You should remember it in English as well, and you won't make so many grammatical mistakes. Don't ever say to who, because it has to be the object of a preposition. So she gave the ring to her brother who was older than she was, whose wife had died, to whom their father had entrusted his cattle, whom the city exiled. We have the same main clause in each of these. We have the same antecedent of the relative in each of these. It's always the brother, but it's doing something different in each subordinate clause, so it is in a different case in each subordinate clause. So they're all the who, the relative pronoun, will always be masculine singular to match brother, but in the first example, who was older, it's the subject and will be in the nominative. In the second example, it's the possessive genitive. In the third example, it's the dative indirect object. And in the fourth example, it's the accusative direct object. So we don't inflect much in English, but who and whom is a word that we do inflect in English. So this is what we're going to be talking about. Now, how do you make relative pronouns? Well, it's actually very, very easy. Remember your old friend, the definite article, that which you need to learn before you learn anything else. If you take the T's off, take the towels off, and add rough breathings throughout, and make sure everything has an accent, you have yourself the definite relative pronoun. You have the word who or what. So instead of ho, the nominative singular article, we have hos. That's the one that changes. It adds a sigma, but hos, hu, ho, hon, instead of ho, tu, to, ton. So it looks just like the article without the tau, and it's rough breathings throughout. So it's very, very easy to spot these. Now, how do you make a tree with a relative clause? Well, the relative clause hangs like a normal clause in that you make a sort of subtree out of it with nouns and objects and adverbs and all. You can have subordinate clauses and everything. But the verb of the relative clause hangs on whatever word is the antecedent. So if it's hanging on a noun, it usually hangs as an attribute because it's acting like an adjective. If it's hanging on an adverb, like this battle happened then when it was already light. So the when clause is a kind of relative clause that hangs on the then as another adverb. So your typical relative clause will look something like this. It's very, very straightforward. Philocles was the general of the Athenians. Main sentence, very easy. Now, what general was he? Who killed them? Very simple. Who, hos, is the relative clause in the nominative singular masculine. It is the subject of the verb of the relative clause, so you label it as such. But the whole clause is modifying the general. And so you hang the verb on the general as an attribute. Okay, I hope that's straightforward. The antecedent is masculine singular, so hos is masculine singular, but it's nominative because it's the subject of the clause. So you get your gender and number from the antecedent. You get the case from what it's doing in the clause. All right, here's another example. He made the entire city of Ephesus, so the entire city Ephesus, worthy of the goddess. That's a genitive here, this theos. So he made the city worthy of the goddess, so that's an O-comp, that's fine. But what city is it? Hain en Hay. Sorry, Ain en Hay. Get it right. Ain, the verb to be, it was. In whom? In which? Because the antecedent is, we can see from the pronoun, the antecedent is feminine singular, which means it modifies Poland. So the city in which he was, so in which he was staying, he was in which would be the full sentence if we had it written out as a main clause. So the verb hangs as an attribute on the antecedent. The prepositional phrase in which is the p-nom, the predicate nominative. He was in which. So the pronoun is feminine singular to match polis, and it's acting as a p-nom, but in this case, it is the object of the preposition. So it's dative. So we have another problem, though, when there is no antecedent. It's very common in Greek, just as in English, to elide the antecedent, to just leave it out. And one solution would be to put it back in each sentence, but that can be tricky and it's unnecessary. What we do instead is we just make the whole clause act as the antecedent, and so that means the verb of the clause stands in for the antecedent. So it's labeled differently. Instead of being the attribute of something, it has to take the place of whatever it would have been labeled modifying. So in this case, for example, they were eager, especially eager, or sorry, that man was especially eager to do something, to do that thing which Cyrus asked for. Adeoma is a deponent verb here in the aorist passive form. Cyrus asked for which. Per just makes it a little bit stronger, but there is no word tuto or whatever would have been. That man did that thing which Cyrus asked for. So instead of being an attribute on tuto, you take the verb and make it instead what the tuto would have been. So it's the object of the doing. That man did what Cyrus asked. The accusative, because it's the object in the clause, it's an accusative neuter singular. Mentoi, by the way, just makes a strong, by God, he did it. It makes it a little bit stronger, of course. And per on the relative is just a slight intensifier that you usually don't need to translate in any way. But this is something to keep in mind because relative clauses are very, very common. Another example of this. So the main sentence is easy. The army from Lacedaemonia did not remain, but it went or came to the wall of Haliartios. Then we have this weird clause here, with whom he held. This is not grammatical. This is not grammatical. Just like we speak ungrammatically sometimes, they write in a kind of shortcut. And we call this, when something's in the wrong case because it's close to something else in that case, it's called attraction. And in the case of relative clauses, it's very easy to omit pieces and change the relative clause, the case in the relative clause. So if I wrote this sentence out in full, he came to the wall with the men whom he held. So it would have been soon, I don't know, tutois, some pronoun, some demonstrative pronoun, soon tutois, eichein hus, whom he held. So the object of eichein should be accusative. And it should be hanging on the prepositional phrase in the main clause. But instead of doing that, they've just kind of elided the whole thing, shortened the whole thing. With those whom he held has become he held with those. With whom? He held with whom. And so this is just wrong grammar, right? But it's often used. It's only in restrictive clauses. It's only when the relative pronoun should be an accusative. So it should be the object of eichein, the accusative. And it's only when the antecedent should be a genitive or a dative. Often it's used with prepositional phrases. So instead of soon tutois, with those men, hus eichen, whom he held, we have this shortcut. And it's problematic to hang it because the labels are all messed up. So because the antecedent would have been an adverb, he came to the wall with them, you make the verb of the relative clause an adverb. And even though it's in a preposition, in the relative, it should be an object. So basically, everything gets messed up in this form. But it happens a lot, and you just got to get used to it. It's just a shorthand way of speaking. Now, that's the definite relatives. Who, which, whom. What if you want to say whoever? Well, it's pretty simple. You just take the definite relative and you add the indefinite pronoun, which, as you'll remember, is tis tina, right? Tis ti, tinos, um, anyone, someone, a certain one. Without an accent, it just means anyone. You put these two together and you have yourself whoever or whatever. So it's very, very easy to spot. You've got the rough breathing, you've got the accents, you've got tistina. So you shouldn't have any problem seeing this or being comfortable with this. So here's an example, and later by not much, it was a care to the Athenians. So it bothered the Athenians, and they voted that bonds be of those men. So bonds be posted by those men. Which men? Whoever hoitenes deceived the people. So it's acting like a regular attribute. It's explaining the men. It's explaining the auton. So it's nominative plural. It's the subject of the verb of the relative clause, whoever deceived the people. So it's labeled as subject and it's in the nominative. And that's the difference between these men who deceive the people and anyone who deceives the people. So that's indefinite. Likewise, we have relative adjectives that we see fairly often. Hoios, meaning such a man. Hopoios, of what sort. Hosos, as great or as many. Hoposos, all who. If you get that P in there, it usually makes it into an interrogative or a question word or an indefinite. So relative adverbs. We've seen who meaning where, hupu means wherever. Hothen, whence, from where, whenever. Whither, to wherever. Right? So you just add typically a P into the adverb and you become indefinite. Hos, like or as, hopos, how. So all these things, panta tauta, ein, hopla, all these things are weapons. Which things? We have hoposois in the dative. Men work by means of which things? The ground and wood and stone. So all these things are weapons, whichever men use to work the ground and wood and stone. So hopoisois is an adverb because it's a dative of means or instrument, really an instrument. It's a neuter plural because its antecedent is tauta, and the whole clause hangs as an attribute on that tauta. He was teaching the men at didaske tous, the ones in the Piraeus, what sort of things they needed. And what we get is hoiachrane with the poiein, the to do, left out, right? What they needed to do, what they needed to have. Some verb is left out there. So cray takes a subject that's an infinitive. So to do which things, accusative. It is necessary. Again, we've lost the antecedent, so there's no, um, you know, I don't know, tutar or whatever to be an antecedent there. And so the verb stands as the object of teach. We've already talked to some extent about these, but there's such a thing as correlatives. We have them in English, we have them in Greek. These are pronouns, adjectives, adverbs that correspond to each other, either in pairs, that one, who, so many, how many, there, where. So we get a lot of main clauses with that one, and then a relative clause, who, then, and then a relative clause explaining when. But there's different kinds of correlatives. So we have the question word, the interrogative word who, the indefinite, which is someone, the definite or demonstrative, which is this one, the relative who that is who, and the indefinite relative whoever. So we get this for time, when, sometime, then, when, whenever. We get this for quantity, how many of some quantity, so many as, however many. And so there are lists of correlatives in Smythe, and this is an example of correlative pronouns and adjectives. Now, by far the most common is tis. So tis, as you first met it without an accent in clitic, means someone or anyone. Tis with an accent can be an inner, the word is the word who, whether in a direct question or an indirect question. Who, what. To say this one, we use one of the demonstratives. For the relative, it's hos, and for the indefinite relative, it's hostos. Right? These are the ones you see most often. Heteros is fairly common. We've already seen that. It means one of two. So it makes it clear that there's only two possibilities. You also see hosos quite often as, as much as many as, and it has the definite so much, so many, and the indefinite however much, however many. You'll also see posos occasionally. Toyusta, it's usually toyusta or toyutos is what shows up. Of what sort? Hoyos is a fairly common word that we'll deal with as we come to it. So these are the most common, and I've given this to you on your handout. Remember, I want to talk about questions really briefly. Remember that the sign of a question is a semicolon. It's used for a question mark. And so these words tis, t, for example, without an accent, who, the indefinite pronoun is an indefinite pronoun without an accent, but with an accent, it is the interrogative, who, what. Now that can introduce a relative clause, but it can also introduce a sentence. So something like this: for who tis remains, kata leipetai, who is well disposed to them, who remains well disposed to them. This eumene is having a good mind towards them. So it starts with tis, and like many of our question words, the question word is usually at the front of the sentence. Notice the semicolon marks it as a question. Or the indirect question: the Athenians were at a loss what it was necessary to do. And again, the question word what, t, usually introduces the indirect question, and what's between it and the verb is part of the indirect question. So we have that. And likewise, there are correlative adverbs. So we've seen a lot of these already. We've seen enthade, we've seen echathan, we've seen enthada, right? We've seen a lot of these already. I want to point out hupu wherever is fairly common. Pu shows up quite a lot as well, especially in the enclitic form. Somehow, somewhere, it kind of an, I guess, put in the sentence. Another very common set here are when, then, sometime. So pota with an accent is when, pota without an accent is whenever or sometime or anytime. Tota is then. Hota, we've already seen introducing temporal clauses, and hopota whenever. So these are very, very common. Don't forget that indefinites are enclitic. And then finally, the how words are very, very common. We've already seen hos meaning as or how. You can put something in, take the demonstrative and make it adverbial to say the same thing, thus or how. Pulse without the accent, somehow. Pulse with the accent, how. So for example, how, again, it's starting a question. The question word tends to be first, the interrogative. How were these things not more unjust than those things? Genitive of comparison. So how were these things not more unjust than those things? Right? And the question word just hangs on the verb as an adverb. So we have some new vocabulary. The most commonly occurring forms, just as if or when, I should have when up there. These are all words you see quite a lot, often in the same sentence. So such a kind, at what kind, so many, how many. We'll see that in relative clauses all the time.